Hey guys, welcome back to ADBC History. I'm Dan, I'm a researcher in ancient history and archaeology, and I'll be your host for today's video on the gladiatorial games of ancient Rome. In this video, we'll see some of the types of gladiators that fought in the Roman arenas, and the kinds of weapons they were equipped with. And by the end of the video, we'll have answered the question, did Roman gladiators actually fight to the death? But gladiators weren't the only competitors in the great Roman games, and the bloodthirsty citizens of Rome could also expect to see chariot races, fights against wild animals, and even fake naval battles between Roman warships. All this and more will be covered in a number of upcoming videos, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on the rest of the series. But for now, let's get straight into it. The first gladiatorial games were held in Rome in 264 BC. The games were called munera, singular munus, which means both duty and gift, as they were typically organised by important Roman politicians as a gift to the Roman people. But Roman politicians were expected to give gifts of this kind, which could also include public feasts, donations of huge sums of money to the poor, or other spectacular entertainments such as chariot racing, which is why these gifts were also referred to as a duty. The gladiators which fought in the munera were usually slaves or convicted criminals, as it was considered extremely dishonourable for free Romans to fight in the arena, especially the upper classes. The Emperor Commodus made himself extremely unpopular by fighting in the Colosseum, but Commodus liked it so much, especially fighting against wild animals, that he had himself depicted in statues as Hercules, a famous slayer of mythological monsters. You can identify Hercules by the skin of the Nemean lion on his head, which was one of the monsters he fought, as well as the wooden club that he carries. Roman gladiatorial combats were usually duels, fought between two carefully matched gladiators. Fairness was actually very important to the Romans, as they didn't like a fight with a predictable outcome where one side was easily slaughtered. Well, most of the time. So for this reason there were different types of gladiators which were given carefully chosen weapons and armour, which had distinct strengths and weaknesses, and which gave each fighter opportunities to exploit. This way each fight was genuinely exciting and unpredictable. The types of gladiators also deliberately resembled the various enemies that the Romans had fought over the centuries, recreating historical battles in miniature. Let's go through some of the most common types of gladiators. The Hoplomachus was modelled on a Greek hoplite and was given a round shield, a broad-rimmed helmet, a spear, though this was probably thrown rather than used for stabbing like a real hoplite's, and a short sword to use after throwing the spear. A Hoplomachus was usually made to fight against a Thraex or a Murmillo. The Murmillo, whose name comes from a Greek word for a kind of fish, carried a big square shield, wore a large helmet with a stylised fish crest, fought with a sword, and was most usually seen against a Thraex or a Retiarius. The Thraex, the Thracian, representing the peoples who came from what is today the northernmost part of Greece, wore a broad-rimmed helmet decorated with a griffin, carried a small round shield, had a spear which was probably also thrown, and then used a distinctive short curved sword. You're probably familiar with the Retiarius, who carried a rete, a net, with which to entangle his opponent, and was also given a trident like the Roman sea god Neptune. Perhaps this fisherman versus fish symbolism was why the Retiarius was often paired against a variant of the Murmillo called a secutor, who had a full face helmet. This helmet likely restricted the secutor's vision and made it more difficult to dodge the entangling net of the Retiarius. And now let's look at a real Roman mosaic of gladiators fighting, or possibly training. On the left you can see a Retiarius, who is in big trouble. He's already thrown and lost his net, his trident is broken and mostly lying on the ground, and he's been wounded in the leg. His opponent, a secutor carrying a big square shield like a Roman legionnaire, is closing in for the kill. The next along is a Thraex, who is fighting a Murmillo, who can be identified by the distinctive fish on his helmet. Then we have a Hoplomachus looking much like a real Greek hoplite, except for his much smaller shield and closed-faced helmet. And finally we have another Thraex, who looks like he's giving his opponent the finger, but is actually surrendering via a method called the summa rudis, which we'll talk about more in a moment. He's accompanied by a Lannister, who is either gesturing with his stick or whacking the Thraex and encouraging him to get back into the fight. As I said, gladiators could also end a fight by surrendering via a method called the summa rudis, the raised finger, which would request missio, or release. The editor, who is a sort of judge or referee running the fight, would then decide whether the gladiator had fought hard enough and whether they deserved to be spared. This is the famous thumb up or thumb down gesture, which you've probably seen in the movie Gladiator. A thumb up meant that the gladiator was spared, and a thumb down that he would be killed. The summa rudis could also be used as a trick, where a gladiator would pretend to surrender and then cut their opponent down while they turned towards the editor to see his decision. We know this from the tombstone of one unfortunate gladiator, which translates as follows: "Here I lie victorious, Diodorus the wretched. After breaking my opponent Demetrius, I did not kill him immediately, but murderous fate and the cunning treachery of the summa rudis killed me." But if gladiators could surrender, does that mean they always fought to the death? Most academics think so, but I'm personally not so sure. Firstly, gladiators, like all slaves, were very expensive to purchase and to maintain. They had to be fed, clothed, and housed, and in the case of gladiators, probably trained fairly intensively as well. That doesn't seem like a very good business proposition for a Roman gladiator owner, who would have had a 50% chance of losing their investment the first time their gladiator went into the ring, and then 50% again every time thereafter. Perhaps the gladiators' owners were compensated in some way if their gladiator didn't make it, but given how expensive they were, this seems unlikely for the many lesser gladiatorial games which are held in the much smaller towns right across the empire. Secondly, gladiators are known to have developed careers and considerable reputations as they fought in these lesser contests, before eventually moving up to major cities and eventually to the greatest games at Rome. People would flock to a contest to see a particular gladiator, just as they do to see famous fighters today, like Floyd Mayweather or Conor McGregor. But how could gladiators build up such a reputation if they kept getting killed? Perhaps it was only in Rome, where the biggest games were held, the equivalent to a world championship, the gladiators fought all the way to the death. Or, in the smaller regional contests, perhaps most of the fights went to the first blood, and only the big fight at the end, the climax of the event, was when someone was actually killed. I think it would make more sense if gladiators had a career of sorts in the smaller regional contests to develop their skills and their reputations, before moving up to more significant contests with deadlier consequences for making a mistake. This would have made fights more exciting, with a pool of experienced professionals to draw upon to fight against each other, rather than constantly pitting them against amateurs who would die before they had a chance to learn. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below which version you think is correct: the common view in academia that gladiators always fought to the death in all fights, or my view that regional contests may not have been so lethal. Okay, that's all we've got time for today. Remember that there are several more videos just like this one coming up on the other events in the Roman games, such as fights between people and animals, chariot races, and even fake naval battles. I might even do an episode dedicated specifically to the greatest arena in the ancient world, the Flavian Amphitheatre, known today as the Colosseum. So subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss the rest of this series. Anyway, I'm your host Dan, and thanks for watching this episode of ADBC History. Booyah, motherfucker! I am done filming for today. Except for the screen recording I need to do later. Now I get some dinner.